I'm going to give a quick recap to try to catch you up, but it might be helpful to also talk to your friends who were in class as well. All right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. All right. Um, So this is a quick introduction to photojournalism. The biggest thing that you're going to make a decision about is how much light is allowed into your camera. So the amount of light that reaches your camera sensor or film controls how bright or dark your pictures appear. This is what exposure is. So your camera goes and the lens opens and allows light in. So you get to make a decision about how wide you want to open that and how quick you open that. And then also how sensitive your sensor is. Okay. So exposure, this is a properly exposed image. You can see that the sky is blue, the grass is green. You see a lot of detail around the image. This is when you allow too much light in. Colors tend to turn white because there's so much light, it can't distinguish between them. This is an underexposed image where all of a sudden your image is dark. You're losing details on the grass. You're losing details in the trees and the shadows. So again, you're trying to get this properly exposed image. And underneath your camera, when you engage the shutter, you're going to be able to see a meter, and you'll see that it says -1, -2, -3, and then +1, +2, +3. And it's going to look like this, right? It's a little meter. And in the middle is 0. And in the middle, you are going to want to get the meter towards the center of the frame. So towards 0. You're trying to change the settings so that you can get towards that 0. Okay. So the 3 ways that you can control light coming in to the camera is, again, how wide the opening is and which is the aperture, how quick it opens, which is the shutter speed, and then the ISO is the sensitivity of your sensor. All of my slides are online, so I'm going to go through this very quickly, but you should go back and look at the slides from class online. Aperture mimics your eyes. So your pupils expand when you need more light and get really tiny when there's a lot of light in a scenario, right? Same idea. You are going to have your aperture be wider when you need to allow more light in, or smaller when you don't want to allow quite as much light in. It ends up looking like this. F2.8 is very little. Your camera only goes to 3.5. That will allow the most amount of light in through the opening, which is called the aperture. F22, I think yours even goes up into the 30s, is going to be a very tiny opening and allow very little light in. Okay. But all 3 of these portions of the exposure triangle, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, they all impact how much light is allowed in. But in addition to that, they impact something else. Aperture impacts what we call depth of field. So how much of the frame is in focus? So it might be this much, or it might be this much, or it might be this much, and it's away from the camera, right? So sometimes everything in your picture is going to be in focus, but also sometimes you're going to want a shallow depth of field where someone's in focus and their background is blurry. Okay, so this is a good example. This is a shallow depth of field. This hat is in focus, but everything else is out of focus. That's a shallow depth of field. The one on the right is a wider depth of field where almost everything's in focus. You can see details all the way down to the corn and to the bales of hay in the back. A very wide opening allows for a very shallow depth of field. Okay. And over here, a very tiny opening allows for a very large depth of field. The easiest way to remember this is aperture is depicted and measured in f-stops. A smaller f-stop number, f2.8, is going to be smaller depth of field. F22 is going to be a larger depth of field. And to actually know how much light is allowed, and these are actually fractions. So 1 over 2.8 is going to be bigger. 1 over 22 is going to be much smaller. Okay. So F22, F2.8, you're going to get something like this on the left. F18, you're going to get something more like this. All right. So this is a very shallow depth of field, something like F2.8. This is a very large depth of field where you can see details on the house and the water all over the image. You can see details. This should be a very large depth of field. I actually think there's a lot of information that's lost when you use a very shallow depth of field. Okay. Shutter speed is how wide, shutter speed is how quick that opening is open. So aperture is how wide, right? Can be really little or really big. Shutter speed is how quick that is open, okay? It's also called the exposure time, and we refer to it in seconds. So if you only change the shutter speed, a quicker shutter speed is going to allow less light in, and a longer shutter speed is going to allow more light in, just for the fact that less light could get in and more light could get in, right? So in addition to deciding how much light is allowed in, it also, shutter speed is the thing that allows you to make decisions around freezing or showing motion. Here, this is a long shutter speed. It's open for a long time, enough time for a car to move from one end of the image to the other. So this is a long shutter speed. That might be something like a half a second, right? Or maybe even longer than that, maybe 2 or 3 seconds long. This is a very fast shutter speed, and it's freezing motion. This might be 1/1000th of a second, 1/2000th of a second, right? So a very fast shutter speed can freeze motion. This is probably 1/400th of a second, maybe 1/800th of a second. How fast your shutter speed is will change depending on how fast the thing is that's moving, right? Mud is probably moving slightly faster than this football player. This, you can tell that it froze what's in the middle, but that the people on the swings are moving a little bit faster. This is probably like 1/30th of a second. It's enough to get it in focus and to freeze a little bit of it, but the fastest moving images are out of focus. ISO is the last side of the exposure triangle, and it has to do with the sensitivity of the image filter. What you need to know is that the lower the ISO number, the less grain or noise. 100, less grain. Way up here, you see all this noise and pixelation in the image, right? So you want to try to keep your ISO as low as possible. But if you are only changing ISO, lower numbers are going to be darker and higher numbers are going to be lighter and more sensitive to light. So a little bit of light goes a much longer way at a higher ISO. The issue is that the higher ISO, the higher the grain. So in order for this to, how this makes sense is if you are in a situation that has a lot of available light, the first thing you're going to do is think, okay, there's a lot of light here. I'm going to have a very low ISO. I'll use maybe 100 or 200 or 400. But if you're in a scenario that's really dark, you're going to want a much higher ISO. So I might, if I'm shooting a photograph of my roommate in our dorm room, I might start at 6400 or 3200 because I know that there's not going to be a lot of light. All right, let me do this. Okay. On your camera, this is the second portion of this assignment, you are going to put the battery in here. The battery goes into the bottom of your camera. And don't jam anything into a technological device. Just move it slowly. So I'm going to put, the Canon is actually facing down. I'm going to snap it in. And then I can close this, right? And then my SD card is going to go in the side. So it will show you a little map symbol of what you do. You kind of slide it in there, click it. and it goes in there. Then we're going to turn it to on at the very top. We'll go this way. I'm going to turn it to on. That maybe made more sense. To on. And over here against this notch, I want it to be on M, which is manual mode. And then you're able to see the back of your camera. There's a lot of different options. If you click it like this, you can actually see what you're able to see on the outside. So for example, here, you can actually see me right through the camera. That might be really helpful to use this method and mode. Okay. So here at the bottom, this is your shutter speed. You can just move it like this. Click out, or click this arrow when you're done. This right here is your aperture. It goes all the way when it's zoomed out to 4.5. It actually goes to 3.5 if you zoom out. And then your ISO is over there on the side. So you can see all of it. And this right here is your meter. The bold notch in the middle, that is 0. That's your 0. Okay. So also, if you want to do it in a less digital way, I use this this menu. So I just press this little button and it allows me to see this menu. And the wheel at the top of your camera right here allows you to change your settings. So the first thing is I'm just going to move the wheel around and it's going to change my shutter speed. If I only move the wheel, it allows me to change my shutter speed. And then if I hold down this AV button, it allows me to change my f-stop. So if I hold down AV and move it, you can see that my f-stop number is moving. And then at the very top, I have a button called ISO way up here, and I can hold that and toggle through to pick my ISO. If I want to see my meter, I hold my camera down and it'll show me kind of where my meter is. Right here, that arrow is way on this side. So it's saying you are really underexposed. So I want to have more light. I'm going to go up here to ISO and I'm going to move all the way up high and see what happens. Now, all of a sudden, my meter is closer to 0, right? So the goal for this assignment is to try to expose correctly, get things close to 0, get your meter close to 0, but also to try to get your images to have motion, show, and freeze motion, and to have a setting that has a shallow depth of field and a larger depth of field. Okay, so this is going to take a lot of practice. But that is brief introduction to what you missed.